Hello, my name is Sydney, and my presentation is titled A Tale of Two Lobbies, Interest Group Influence, and US-Vietnam Rapprochement. Just to start off, rapprochement or normalization is the process of two states creating closer relationships with one another. So, the Vietnam War. I'm sure all of you have heard of the Vietnam War. It is a very notable moment in global politics and especially in American foreign policy. It was fought for 20 years and it created a sense of devastating loss for both sides of the war, so intense in the United States to create something called Vietnam syndrome, this sense of hesitation towards American intervention abroad. However, this is not the topic of my Keystone project, or at least not entirely the topic of my Keystone project. This is a picture of then Vice President Joe Biden and General Secretary of Vietnam, Nguyen Phu Trong. And now the Vietnam relationship with the US looks so much different than in 1975. We had this devastation from war that has transformed into this very close relationship in terms of economics, politics, and security. And so my project seeks to understand this change over time, and specifically this change over time under the Clinton administration. So this is a general timeline under the Clinton administration of the change of the US-Vietnam relationship. And you can see that in the course of only a couple years, we have these massive shifts in the circumstances of the relationship. So in 1994, we see the lifting of the trade embargo put in place by the United States. In 1995, we see the normalization of diplomatic relations. This is kind of the crux of rapprochement. We have 1995, the waiving of the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, which essentially allows for continued trade with Vietnam, its solidification of trade over a longer period of time. And finally, in 2000, we have the US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement. This is a true solidification of the economic relationship between the two states. And recently, in 2020, we had the 25th anniversary of diplomatic relations. This was a widely celebrated event meant to kind of harken back to this changed relationship. So my initial research question going in is, how did we get from the Vietnam War to the bilateral trade agreement? And especially, what were the circumstances that created the specific process that led to that change under the Clinton administration? So general understandings of rapprochement include a simple result of geopolitical circumstances. We saw the fall of the Soviet Union. It was a lot more acceptable for the United States to work with a communist socialist state. We see realities of economics. Vietnam underwent massive economic growth in the late 1980s under the Doi Moi economic reforms, and we see pressure from US allies like Japan and France to allow for the opening up of relationships with Vietnam. We also see changing Vietnamese domestic policies, looking to have more close, friendly relationships with states like the United States and vice versa. And finally, we see distance from the war. It's been 20 years. It's time to move on from this sentiment. However, we also see in the literature American business interests and remaining issues with prisoner of war, missing in action soldiers, specifically in account of recovery efforts. So actually going in and taking the bodies of soldiers that have passed in war. And these two sort of parties pop up occasionally throughout the literature. So as I was able to do research at the Clinton Presidential Library in Little Rock, Arkansas, and actually go through archival documents from the Clinton administration to better understand the role of these two groups during this time. And these are some documents. It looks like a big jumble of words on the screen, but when we look through these documents, we begin to see patterns emerge in these two groups popping up over and over again. So on the left, you see major American corporations such as Boeing, AOL, Coca-Cola, and their continued involvement in Vietnam under the Clinton administration. On the right, you see the involvement of the National League of Prisoner of War and Missing in Action Families, also just known as the League, and its leader, Ann Mills Griffith, again, appearing over and over in these documents. And so my research question sort of involved into how did these interest groups influence the US-Vietnam rapprochement process under the Clinton administration? First, it's good to look at these two groups in tandem. First, we have corporate America, who is in favor of immediate rapprochement for the purpose of wanting to enter into the market as soon as possible. Vietnam was in this stage of immense economic growth, and US companies didn't want to miss out on the economic opportunities that were present. This was the case for a large amount of Southeast Asian states, but especially for Vietnam at this time. And so their lobbying efforts sought to see, we want trade now, we want involvement in Vietnam now. The League, on the other hand, wanted to delay rapprochement for the purposes of using it as a bargaining tactic with the Vietnamese government in order to achieve fullest possible accounting of prisoner of war and missing in action soldiers. It's important to note that this is highly unusual for a post-war environment. You're not typically going to see fullest possible accounting as a goal, as it is quite a lofty goal, but it was ultimately the goal for this particular lobbying group. And so while these goals are not fundamentally in opposition to one another, they were ultimately in practice in opposition to one another. And so my analysis kind of seeks to look at the micro scale of foreign policy formation in the United States. What occurs in these little interactions in the archives that influences decisions, timelines, and rhetoric? It's often thought of foreign policy formation as coming from the Oval Office or the briefing room. But when we look at these documents, that's not always necessarily the case. The concerns of interest groups appear continuously throughout these Clinton-era documents, especially in regards to correspondence from members of Congress who are in one way or another influenced by these groups. And so it's looking at, in conjunction with the timeline shown earlier, how the administration handles these concerns. So one finding that I found is delayed timelines and changed rhetoric. Obviously, you're starting off with 20 years of delayed timeline. Under the Carter administration, they were hoping to move forward with rapprochement immediately following the war, and it did not occur until 1995. So you have this larger scale delaying coming from the influence of the League, and you have sort of this every step becomes this rhetorical battleground. These quotes kind of illustrate the need of the Clinton administration to point away from economic determinants as a reason for moving forward with rapprochement because they wanted to continue appeasing this group. We also see continued involvement and influence by these parties. This includes invitations to delegations or forums, seats on relevant committees, most especially in Mills Griffith's seats on a recovery effort committee that only like congressmen and national security advisors were otherwise sitting on. And again, the invoking of actors in Congress who were sort of fighting the fight in legislation for these groups, especially the National League of Prisoner of War and Missing in Action families. These invitations to delegations saw businesses and members of the League alike go to Vietnam in 2000. So they never sort of stepped back from the issue during this period of time. They continued to be involved in sort of these national outreach systems to the civil society. And finally, we also see tangible outcomes. The Clinton administration was incredibly successful, especially being more delayed past the war in their accounting missions. And so this was a success for the League, despite the fact that they ultimately did move forward with rapprochement. And ultimately, American corporations were able to significantly shape the bilateral trade agreement that went forward in 2000. So in conclusion, foreign policy influence comes from a variety of places, including domestic civil society. It does not come just from the Oval Office, just from the briefing room. And we can see these little micro-scale interactions as examples of how that actually goes through. This influence during the US-Vietnam rapprochement process creates these small-scale changes that did shape the outcome, and those were some of the ways that it occurred. And this influence was neither successful nor unsuccessful. While ultimately rapprochement did occur, and you can say that corporate America won out in the end, the League was able to achieve a scale of accounting that is otherwise sort of inconceivable in other conflicts. And so the scale of change over time is incredibly notable and sort of shows the impact that civil society can have on foreign policy formation. So thank you for listening to my presentation. Special thanks to my advisor, Dr. Mary Rumenchik, Professor Davidson, and Professor Cook, and my friends and family. And here are some image sources.
Okay, so we have a couple minutes for questions.
Great job, super interesting, really enjoyed it and loved the flow of everything. My question is, after like all your conclusions, what do you said, at the end in the bullet point said this is not successful or successful, right? What would you say is like a major takeaway or lesson that maybe the US can take from this and how they dealt with this with like future foreign policy? Yeah, that's my question. Like, is there like a major takeaway?
I would say the most significant takeaway is accounting for the influence of civil society in foreign policy formation, or at least like recognizing the presence that is there. I think a lot of literature, especially about this time period, again, focuses on solely on these economic factors, and that doesn't create good predictions moving forward for foreign policy making in the future. I also think it kind of points to the impact of individuals on foreign policy, and not individuals who are like the president of the United States, but individuals that are kind of working at the ground level to lobby for their various interests.
That was a great presentation. You mentioned that there was pressure from U.S. allies for rapprochement, and I just was wondering, like, if this was linked at all to corporate America, or if there's like an example you could provide of that kind of pressure.
Yeah, so the initial 1994 lifting of the trade embargo, the US was very much in control of a lot of the international trades and investment systems at the time. And so it was kind of like if the US said it wasn't okay, it wasn't okay. And these companies, recognizing the expansion of the Vietnamese market, wanted that expansion to occur. So it was in tandem with the US corporate interests, but it was also the corporate interests of Japanese firms and French firms and British firms who all saw the same economic potential for trade and investment in Vietnam.
We have time for another question, if there is one.
Thank you so much for that. And I really appreciated the way that you walked us through how your research question changed after your time in the archives. Are there any other issues that your experience with research has inspired you to think about differently?
That's such a good question. I would say one thing that popped up for me, and it's sort of a limitation of my project, is the lack of access to the level of lobbying that American corporate world had on this particular issue. There's not a lot of documentation actually about their specific influence, but it's really well noted that it was there. And so that sort of made me consider in every other foreign policy issue and determinant that involves these really significant economic interests, what are we not seeing in terms of the influence of corporate America and how that has created has shaped the way that those decisions have been made, not necessarily a yes or no to the decision, but the process for that decision making.
Thank you, Sydney.